Good afternoon and welcome to the DCRI Research Conference. Thanks to those of you that have braved the elements, maybe just walking down from your office, but I know that some people actually were out there, and a lot of people will be joining us remotely today, and others reviewing the presentation in our archive, which is why it's there. But I'm very excited. I've been looking forward to this presentation for a while because it's information that I believe represents kind of the spirit of Duke University of being forward-thinking and really on the cutting edge. And I'm pleased to have Jeffrey Taekman here with us today. Dr. Taekman is the Assistant Dean for Educational Technology. He's the Director of the Human Simulation Patient Safety Center and a neuroanesthesiologist here at Duke University Medical Center. And he's chosen a topic that certainly is quite pertinent and translates very, very well to the DCRI, and that is addressing the first patient effect, the role of simulation in clinical trial design and implementation. Dr. Taekman.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me today and driving through this interesting weather. My name is Jeff Taekman, and I am going to talk to you a little bit about simulation and clinical trials. Before I get started, I wanted to give you a couple of my disclosures. The one to pay the most attention to is here at the bottom, that one of the projects I'm going to show you could potentially become a commercial product. The other thing before I get started, I want to thank our team that's working on this particular area, Mark Stafford-Smith, who is my colleague in the Department of Anesthesiology, Melanie Wright, who is a human factors engineer, and then Barbara Phillips-Butte, who is a statistician. And so, as I mentioned, I want to talk about clinical trials and simulation. This is an area that we've been interested in for a long time. Only recently, though, several of our peer institutions have started to show some interest as well. Mayo Clinic, I know, is interested in this as well. Stanford and Penn have all now shown interest in getting involved in this domain, but it was started here. A little about me. I am a neuroanesthesiologist and then direct the Human Simulation and Patient Safety Center here at Duke, and then work with the School of Medicine looking and integrating educational technology into the curriculum. So our simulation center is actually the original simulation center here. There's three now. A relatively small place. We have about 1,600 square feet, 2 simulation rooms side by side, then a small classroom and a couple other areas to do immersive education. This is a picture of the main lab. It's usually configured as an operating room, but we can actually emulate just about any place in the hospital. And an emerging trend is actually to take the simulator out into the field, to take it into the hospital using something called in situ simulation. We found out recently that we're going to be moving into the new Medical Center Learning building, the Medical Center Learning Center. We'll be up at the 5th floor as the plans stand right now. And it's exciting. We'll have some new surroundings there as well. Our center is a little bit different than many of the other simulation centers around the country in that we combine human factors engineering and patient simulation immersive learning. So human factors engineers, I'm going to talk about in a second here, but you'll see why this project actually touches on both areas. So human factors engineering is something that you may or may not be familiar with. Human factors engineers are usually trained in both psychology and engineering, and they look at the strengths and weaknesses of humans and the strengths and weaknesses of machines and try to build systems that take advantage of the strengths and minimize the weaknesses. Much of what they do is to try and mitigate error, and there's many different definitions of error. This is Jim Reason's definition. Unintended event that occurs for all sorts of different reasons. Errors can be caused by all sorts of different factors, design factors. There are errors of omission or commission, either something left out or something done incorrectly. There can be environmental factors, or there can be policies that drive people to make mistakes. And kind of the centerpiece of human factors engineering is something called human-centered design. Many of you may be familiar with some of the products that have come from human-centered design. Basically what it is an iterative approach to design where someone conceptualizes something, its prototype is designed, it's run by the users, the end users, and then they make iterative changes to it. And by the time you get down to the implementation, it's gone through many, many levels of testing. Probably the device we all know and love the best are some of Apple's products. They make a lot of use of human factors engineers, and people are pretty enthusiastic about their Apple devices. But it's not just pretty devices that human factors engineering can bring into the mix. This is data from the FAA for airplane building, and they found as they implemented human-centered design, the productivity actually went up and the cost went down in plane building. And most importantly, there was a reduction of errors. So human factors engineers have revolutionized aviation, the military, the nuclear industry. Just like many other areas, medicine's far behind. We are fortunate to actually have one of the few human factors engineers here at Duke. We have two now. It's becoming an increasingly popular area in healthcare. So that's one area that we work on in our center. The other is immersive education. So I don't know if you've all had a chance to view our simulators. They're computer-controlled mannequins. They're very sophisticated. They have heart and lung sounds. We can program their physiology. We can really program them to be just about any patient within a hospital. So we can program the patient, and then we can also craft the surroundings to look like virtually anywhere in healthcare. One of the phenomena we deal with all the time is a learning curve. I know you're all familiar with learning curves, but actually it was described originally in the aviation industry where they found that as they were building planes, initially they made a lot of mistakes, but over time as they practiced and practiced and practiced, the number of errors went down. But interestingly, you could never completely get that error rate to zero. It turns out it's a very frequent component of any complex human behavior. We see it in sports, we see it in work, we see it in procedures in medicine. So it's a ubiquitous behavior, which is why I wanted to talk to you a little bit about simulation in clinical trials. So if you think about clinical trials, many are complex human behaviors that we require our end users to conduct. And just like any other complex human behavior, it takes practice to meet your potential. And if you go back to this human-centered design model and you think about how most clinical trials are developed, it's conceptualized. It goes through a series of reviews, but it may not be tried out until it's actually implemented. It's sent into the wild, and it's only later through amendments that the protocol is revised. So we hypothesized that simulation, human simulation, could potentially help clinical trials in two ways. One is to essentially do a usability study of the trial itself as something we're calling a walkthrough. And the second part is through the actual training of the monitors and coordinators and even investigators. And this plays on the strengths in our center. These are the human factors components, and this is the immersive education. So right around the time we were interested in doing this, the DCRI and GPro had a sponsor called BioMarin that was interested in minimizing the first patient effect. And I had no idea what the first patient effect was. I had never heard of it. But it made some sense that it would be there, knowing what I knew about training in our center for medical care. So I went in the literature, and I really couldn't find anything in the literature. We went around interviewing various people involved in clinical trials, and everyone acknowledged the first patient effect was there. And some very consistent topics kept coming up. And these were some of the things that people talked to us about. Inadequate training came up time and time again as a source of error in the clinical trial. Making the trial too complex was another way that would cause a lot of errors. And you can read through the rest of the list here. So with BioMarin, we were shooting from the hip. We were trying something new. But what we did is we met with the sponsor, and based on what we typically do with our residents and medical students, we figured out what they really wanted to get out of this exercise. The first thing we asked, does it really make sense to use simulation in this case? And for this particular study, it made a lot of sense because it was a complex study, used complex equipment. There were issues of timing. There were many, many different issues that lended itself well to immersive education. So once we decided it made sense, we planned a set of objectives and then developed a detailed list of equipment, because part of this study also involved hooking up a record-keeping system that many of the folks in the field weren't familiar with, and they had to hook it into the actual equipment in an operating room. So we compiled all this data and we put together an exercise. This is what we did. We came up with the objectives. We met with the project manager and tried to figure out the areas where people were most likely to make mistakes. Obviously, we couldn't replicate an entire trial. This was an intraoperative study and would take place actually over several hours. So we had to compress time to make it feasible to have a certain number of people come through. But then we followed the same development process that we do for our learners. We storyboarded the scenario. We developed the timing. And then we programmed our simulator to emulate the perfect scenario where everything went exactly as planned, but also branch points where things might not go as expected, to let them practice how to react to the most expected variances from the protocol. And then we had an expert review both the patient, the scenario, and the scenarios. Once we had that done, we did a walkthrough, and many of you will probably recognize Linda Barber. She was the project manager that really helped a lot with this. And then Mark Stafford Smith. We walked through the protocol in the operating room, in our mock operating room, and had them lay out their drugs, hook up the equipment, and then actually intervene at the right time, give the study drug to the anesthesiologist, take all the steps that were necessary for the protocol. During that usability, during the walkthrough, it actually turned up several problems with the protocol that we were able to fix before the protocol was finalized. So that was the walkthrough. The next part, BioMarin contracted with us to do the monitor training. Just the monitors initially. They wanted just the monitors to understand this protocol and be able to handle any of the issues that might come up. So the monitor group, all the monitors came in a single group for a day-long exercise. The PI, which was Mark Stafford Smith, was embedded within the learning exercise, and the monitors practiced the protocol. They gave the anesthesiologist the study drug at the right time. They had to calculate doses. And while one person was in the hot seat, the rest of the group was watching this activity in a separate room via a video feed. At the end, we did what we do in simulation. We conducted a debrief where we brought everybody together and talked about the issues that came up that they saw and how to best handle those if they see those once the protocol is being implemented. Based on the monitor training, further changes were made to the protocol as well. And also not just the protocol, but also the research form. So this is just a picture from our monitor training. And just to give you an idea of some of the things that were changed because of the walkthrough and the monitor training, I put this slide in there. Things like the amount of the study drug that was given, making the whole implementation of the study easier, making it less complex for the end learner or for the end user. And a couple other things came out of it. This development of a day surgery guide, as the monitors went through, they realized there were certain things that would make their lives easier as well in the trial. And so because of this exercise, a day of surgery guide was also implemented. BioMarin had sent some folks to watch the training, and basically on the spot they decided that they were going to extend that training to all the coordinators as well. So we extended the training to the coordinators, but we built on what we learned with the monitors. We cut the group size down a little bit, or cut the length of the learning exercise to a half day. People get very tired actually in this type of immersive learning exercise in a very long learning exercise. So we cut it down to a half-day experience. We ran the training exercise very similarly with an embedded PI, and we ran through both the normal and the potential variation that the coordinators would see. Again, the coordinators observed in another room, and we debriefed after each person went through. This time we collected some data on their pre- and post-confidence in their ability to actually conduct the study. So these were some of the things that we looked at, both in the affective, the cognitive, and the psychomotor domain. They filled this out before and after. And we found that simulation actually influenced their confidence in the ability to conduct this clinical trial in all three domains, affective, cognitive, and psychomotor. We made a couple interesting observations, though, as well. The first was that each coordinator seemed to learn from the person before, so the debrief actually seemed to make a difference. You can watch someone make mistakes and still learn from that. More than 5 repetitions, though, people just got burnt out. The learning was so intense for them, being in a hot seat and being put on the spot, that was really quite enough for them. There were a couple coordinators that, no matter what happened, they didn't seem to be able to understand the protocol, and for a life-threatening intervention, that could have potential consequences. So this brought up some ethical issues for us as well. For a few people, simulation served as a reality check where people were very confident when they came in. They actually experienced the protocol and they realized they didn't know it as well as they thought they might. If you deployed simulation too early, the learning exercise actually was lost on them. They lost a lot of the things that they picked up in the learning exercise. So timing of the immersive education exercise is very important as well. And an unexpected benefit was, I think, a lot of the monitors and coordinators, because they had input into the final trial design and the research form design, felt more invested in the actual protocol itself. So we published 2 articles. One was on this confidence survey, and the other was on the use of high-fidelity simulation in clinical trials, which talks about the walkthrough and the training. But we realized in order to really interest a lot of sponsors and make a strong argument for why we should use simulation, we had to develop objective measures of performance in clinical trials. So we hypothesized that since the data record is a very accurate indication of the trial itself, that we would be able to see a potential learning curve in the data record of a clinical trial. And so I just wanted to remind you what a learning curve looks like here. But once again, we came up to DCRI, and you all were nice to share the VALIANT data set with us. For those of you, you're all involved in VALIANT here, but just to remind you what it was about, a huge multi-center clinical trial. We were very interested in this trial because it's universally thought of as a very well-run clinical trial and a large but relatively simple clinical trial, not from the logistics but from the intervention. And just to remind you of the scope of VALIANT, 931 sites, 14,703 patients, and almost 275,000 queries. So we took the data set and applied some exclusion criteria. We wanted to take the people that were lost to follow-up out of that data set, anyone that died before the first year, or anyone enrolled at the 80th or higher in the data or in the trial. So we eliminated the numbers there. Additional protocol departure and documentation query exclusions that occurred beyond 12 months. We wanted to look at a fixed period of time. So the data set that we analyzed actually included all 931 sites, 12,367 patients, and you can see the protocol departures and documentation queries. Because we were looking at the data retrospectively and because of how the data set came to us, departures, we called departures actually the violations and deviations. It was one set of data. Again, we call data inconsistencies were your queries, and then there were the adverse events. So this is our analysis. The protocol departures, or these are the protocol violation deviations. Just to orient you here, these are the number of protocol violation deviations on the y-axis, and all 931 sites are actually compiled into that first rank in the data set. So this represents 931 sites, all the patients, all 931 patients that were enrolled first, and so on down the line. So these are protocol violation deviations. These are our queries or protocol departures. And you can see a definite slope to the line here and something that looks very similar to the learning curve within the query data, the VALIANT. So the protocol violation deviations could potentially be a patient safety issue. And the queries or the documentation inconsistencies are an indication of cost. And just to remind you of the scope, 272,998 queries. And I've seen a wide range of the cost of a query, anywhere from $100 a query up to $450 a query. So the potential amount within this early part of the learning curve, if we're able to minimize this learning curve, we're talking a fair amount of money in here, as well as the potential for patient safety, improving patient safety or making trials even safer by flattening this curve. So we wondered if this same phenomenon might occur in multiple clinical trials, and we proposed to develop metrics in order to be able to compare various clinical trials, both to look at usability, but also our educational interventions. We received a grant from the Office of Research Integrity and NINDS to start building a taxonomy of not errors, but variances that occur in clinical trials. We called it variances because not every protocol violation deviation represents an error. And what we did is we took a different data set. We went to University of Iowa at a data set called IHAS-2 and did a similar analysis there. IHAS-2 was a complex intraoperative protocol looking at patient cooling with intracerebral aneurysms. Not quite the scope of VALIANT. It was 30 centers, 1,001 subjects, a good number of queries, and a good number of adverse events. And I just wanted to show you some of the query data. Once again, just to orient you, the data variances, the number of queries per patient are on the y-axis, and all 1,001 patients are in the first rank here, and so on. And once again, something that looks very much like a learning curve. So our clinical research variance taxonomy, we wanted to see if there were certain areas that might be potentially targetable in order to minimize those curves. The variance taxonomy we've broken down into 3 areas: data variances, protocol variances, and then modifiers. Just to give you a high-level introduction to the taxonomy, the data variances included missing data where the field was left blank, an out-of-range data, which was an unexpected number in one of the fields, or inconsistency, where information didn't match up in 2 locations. And then there were protocol variances in our taxonomy, which we broke down into the research personnel and those attributable to patients. And then there were modifiers. There are modifiers. A chain event is something, as one variance occurs and causes another down the line. Those are what we call chains. And then in the focus group that we had, people wanted to be able to tag either a severe patient safety event or something that severely affected the data integrity. So I apologize for the fuzziness of the slide. It didn't turn out well for my Mac. But once again, we did the analysis. These are the queries on the y-axis and patient rank on the x-axis. The very heavy line here is missing data. Out of range data is actually the lowest of the 3 lines. And then information that was inconsistent in 2 locations is somewhere in between. So this hints at ways of, with our computerized record-keeping systems and other things, where are the potential areas of error where, at least in the IHAS-2 trial, forcing people to enter data in a certain way could potentially drop this line. Auto-populating certain fields within a research form could drop this line. So that's what we're trying to tease out now. So that's as far as we've gotten with our research into learning curves in clinical trials. But I want you just to think a little bit about the other side, the immersive education side of things. We talked about usability and walking through a clinical trial. But immersive education, I've already mentioned high-fidelity simulation, but really simulation is it's a technique, and high-fidelity simulation is just a subcomponent of simulation. We use live actors in some of our simulated activities. So if you think about walking through a particular clinical trial, these types of actors might be useful for a psych drug trial. Any place that the mannequin is unable to fill in for either the patient or the research personnel, we do have alternatives there as well. The other area is virtual environments. Our group received a grant from the Army to build a virtual environment for immersive education. It's based on a gaming platform called Unreal. I don't know if there are any gamers here. But this allows people to connect from anywhere in the world and collaborate in a shared virtual space. So we could have people in India connecting with people here, but working together within a shared environment. We're studying this now, comparing outcomes and knowledge, skills, and attitudes between this type of training and high-fidelity simulation. And just to give you an idea of the level of fidelity that's available now in these types of environments, this is something taken from a more recent project of a group called ARA, where it's getting virtually impossible to tell the difference between looking at a photograph or looking at, or determining whether you're looking at a photograph or looking at a virtual environment. There's also the ability for these patients to have their own physiology. So we can program them to act in certain ways, but they can also react as someone administers a drug. The physiology engine takes over and the patient acts appropriately. So currently we have a project that's just started called Iliad, the Immersive Learning Environment at Duke. This is a 5-year project funded by the Duke Endowment to build on what we've learned with virtual environments and enable an immersive learning to occur with our group here in Durham, with our students over in Singapore, and also to allow the students here to work in a shared virtual environment without necessarily having to come together in person. One of the projects that we applied for but did not receive in some of the stimulus grant funding was to take what we had learned about virtual environments and apply that to clinical research in something that we called VECTR, the Virtual Environment for Clinical and Translational Research. But we are hopeful that we'll be able to, at some point in the future, build on what we've learned. So I just wanted to conclude saying that simulation in clinical trials is, I believe, a win for everybody. There's a potential for making clinical trials even safer. There's a win for sponsors and the research organizations in that the trials can be completed more efficiently, hopefully at less cost. And there's a win for simulation as well, because we're always looking for ways to expand the areas that we're potentially able to work in. So I wanted to leave some time for questions, and I wanted to thank this long list of people that have made all this work possible. And thank you very much.
That was very, very interesting, and perhaps I can start things off. Can you tell us a little bit about the VECTR project? Even though it wasn't funded, I would be confident that in the future that you'll probably have better success. And what exactly was it? How did you bring the translational piece into the work that you're doing?
So it was actually to build on our experience with these virtual environments to allow people to train in a virtual environment. So replicate the clinical trial within a virtual environment, let the monitors, coordinators, or investigators practice the protocol, but not necessarily have to come together in a shared location to do that.
Jeff, thanks for sharing this. Kind of two questions. One, you showed, so there's definitely errors in completing the data forms. But that wasn't necessarily things that harm patients. So, it's a paperwork issue. Redundancies where you're asking the same information twice is a design flaw on our part, right? We should never do that. And so those errors are our fault. But the other two classes of errors, out of range or missing data, if we did electronic data collection appropriately, we would reduce those fairly significantly. And I don't know if that's the case. I think VALIANT was before we started doing that.
Right.
So some of that might be a technology on the upfront we could fix. So now that you've looked at all of this, where do you think is the sweet spot for this? Your highly complex studies, things about in-hospital care or acute situations, trauma, those types of things, the visual part of this, but you're also suggesting that the teamwork part where, you haven't sent, simulating consent, can I do a better job with that? Or other places where we think we could propose to sponsors that we include this in DCRI protocols.
Yeah, I think anywhere that you think there is an issue with your trials is applicable. We haven't analyzed enough data to really know what the sweet spot is. We've looked at VALIANT, which was a very, very large, so a logistically complex trial. We've looked at IHAST, which was a very complex intraoperative trial. What we haven't looked at is a complex clinical trial with life-threatening, say the thrombolytics or something, that if you make a mistake, there's a huge potential for patient injury. At this point, I really don't know. We haven't analyzed enough data. I think we have to look at a bunch of different trials to make that decision. But I know simulation, if there's an issue with consent, that's definitely something simulation can help with. You can design something to have people practice the perfect way, but also have very difficult patients to interview. And so that's definitely amenable to simulation.
Yeah, in terms of a commercial for you in your group, how would you package this to a sponsor when you were talking about a trial?
Well, I think we're just trying to build an argument now that it is useful. Eventually, we have to go through and do some sort of economic analysis, see what difference it actually makes in the trial itself. And we're just trying to build the argument now. We started, I think, in the middle and are trying to step backwards now and figure out what would be the most attractive to a sponsor.
So, Jeff, thanks for coming over. I want to follow up on a couple of Kevin's questions, but first I want to, I don't know if you said this at the beginning, that you're going to be spending more time over here, which is appreciated by all of us to begin to help us do some research on actually the research that we're doing. So we're glad that you're here. Along the line of Kevin's questions, I've gone over to your place a few times to see the simulation lab. I've seen the various presentations, but a couple of questions keep nagging at me, one of which is the durability of the training, and has that been formally tested? The second directly follows from Kevin's line of questioning and has to do with the complexity of setting up the training. I mean, is a lot of this stuff reusable, or are you essentially recreating the wheel every single time, in which case the cost may in fact be prohibitive? And then my third question has to do with, what have you learned about the best characteristics of people who respond well to simulation training?
Mm-hmm. So the first part, the durability, I assume you're talking about longevity of training.
Yeah, like so a lot of these trials go on for 2, 3, 4 years, right. And have you tested?
Well, so we haven't in clinical trials, but I can tell you from the simulation literature and things like ACLS, over time your skills degrade, and so you need a redosing actually of the education every so often. And I think we saw a little bit of that with if someone trained in simulation beforehand and then there was a long period of time before they conducted the trial, a lot of the lessons were actually lost. So I don't have an answer to that, but I can tell you there is literature from simulation that it's going to have to be redone if it's a very long trial or there's been a long period between the initial training and the rollout. The reusability question, it really depends on what you're talking about. So if we're talking about high-fidelity simulation many of the props and things that we use are collected over time, and those are reusable. But every educational intervention really does have to be personalized to the trial. It really will be what do they want to get out of it, where are the potential problem areas, and then building something around that. And the third question...
Characteristics of people who respond well to training. I mean, you talk about training the coordinators. We have an ongoing challenge of actually trying to train physicians.
Right.
Who resist coming to meetings, who resist coming to the web.
Right.
And is this better? Or my guess is that physicians don't necessarily do well with it.
Well, so there's actually a range. I think if we're talking about high-fidelity simulation, number one, immersive learning is a much better way of learning rather than listening to lectures. There's been plenty of research in CME and lots of other areas that say watching a lecture does not change your behavior. Getting people there, though, is an issue, and that's why we're very interested in these immersive environments, because you can make it very convenient for someone and not have to have them come over to the simulation center. They're more likely to participate in that learning, the learning exercise. With the virtual environments, though, we've talked about this, there's a huge difference between age groups, though, too. So the younger physicians who have grown up with computers and maybe gamers themselves latch right into these types of virtual environments. The older folks, or the folks that haven't had as much experience with computers, are much more resistant. They're trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B rather than focusing on the learning exercise itself.
So guys like Shulman is hopeless.
Yeah, I don't know if we've tested him.
Brian.
Thank you. That was very interesting. So looking at the graphs that you presented, two things came to mind that I wondered if they were considered in that first analysis. One is, from the coordinating center perspective, we'll often look at something very similar as the rate at which we're sending out queries to sites per patient, and then how we centrally can intervene to decrease that over time. And we'll see a similar trend looking at the work that we're generating, where at the beginning we may be querying lots of data, and then over time we'll decrease that and actively delete the number of things that are being reviewed in the data set. The second was, I know some portion of our sites will only enroll a couple of patients, and then many of the sites will enroll many more.
Mm-hmm.
And what we might also be seeing in there is the attrition of the errors, because the sites that are only enrolling the few patients are dropping out of that sample. So those were some thoughts that I wondered if they were part of what was being reviewed.
Right. So the institutional learning, I think, is what you're talking about with the first point, that as errors are made, you can kind of correct course and figure out if you can intervene in those. Is that what the first? So I didn't show another of the analysis that we did, but it will be in the publication that's coming out in a couple of months. And that is, we analyzed the error rate over time from the rollout of the trial to the date of first enrollment and at each site, and actually that went down over time. The other interesting thing I didn't show was there were several bumps in the data that we think may actually correlate with the amendments to the protocol. Each time a new protocol was rolled out, we'd see a little mini bump in the line. So we haven't analyzed a wide variety of trials. I really think that is the next phase, and to have a lot more people thinking about some of the things that I'm a simulation guy. I don't do clinical trials, but I think it's an interesting area that we should pursue.
Yeah, I think it's very cool. I think there's a lot buried in there that we haven't looked at to discover yet.
And Jeff, I want to get back to one of the first comments that you made about the interface of human behaviors and utilizing technology. And it seemed to me that there was a point beyond which additional learning didn't take place. It's hard to know why that is, if it's complexity or it's innate limitations. But it makes you wonder in some of those very complex protocols whether the technology should be playing more of a role, like a GPS at the bedside for a coordinator or somebody that is trying to negotiate blood draws and changing infusion rates and a variety of things. Isn't there a way to utilize the technology on top of the learning?
What we're trying to build now are the metrics to compare those types of interventions. So if you wanted to look at that, certainly there could. You always have to be careful with technology in that it is a technique, and one of the things we have to be very careful of in simulation is we can't really replace the person-to-person communication, and we always have simulations an intermediate step between the face-to-face interventions, and so I don't think it's a complete replacement, but it is a way of the point can move back and forth based on.
I think it's complementary. I can think over the years of having coordinators at the bedside or in the catheterization laboratory with a manual in front of them, kind of walking down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There could be 20 different steps involved in making sure that the protocol is followed. And it's not to say that a person isn't capable of learning 20 different steps, particularly with practice. But I have to wonder whether there isn't a way to provide a little bit of guidance, not exactly like a GPS to say turn here,
right,
but this would be the next step, and perhaps your protocol violations would lessen by integrating those.
The checklists, if is my understanding you, the checklist looking at almost like a pre-flight checklist for pilots is an area that people are looking at now, the efficacy of those in clinical care, but certainly looking at those in clinical trials would be interesting as well.
Good. Additional questions or comments?
Cheryl Jacobs just handed me a number of copies of the paper that you were doing, and I'm going to put these outside on the table. If anyone, I don't know if we have enough copies for everyone, but they'll be outside on the table if you want to pick them up.
Good. I'd like to thank Jeffrey Taekman for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us and for your questions.
Thank you.